Coding is becoming futuristic now that Visual Studio Code and Copilot have native MCP server integration, which means that you can make sure that your AI has direct access to tools, apps, and databases so that your Copilot agent can actually do things for you. In this video, I'm going to show you a very concrete example of how you can get ahead with this, where Copilot is going to inject dummy data into my database so that I can test my plant care application much faster, as you can see here. So let's get into it. We're going to be working together on using AI to improve my plant care application, because this is an application I developed for my own needs because I have a lot of trouble keeping track of my plants and how I water them. So in this application, I can simply add new plants like so. For example, a little fly trap, which is a Venus fly trap. And this one might be indeed in my living room. And then I can add the plant as such. And inside of the plant's item, I can, for example, keep track of the watering history as well as any observations that I see in terms of, how healthy the plant is and how it's doing. But when you have an application like this, to properly test it, you need a lot of dummy data. And I could add all of this dummy data myself, but nowadays with MCP servers and the new version of Visual Studio Code, I can actually use an MCP server to inject data into my database so that I can test my application much faster and improve it based on that testing data. So how am I going to approach this? Well, if we check out Visual Studio Code, you will see that I have a code base here, and this code base is a Next.js project, and I'm currently using a local database with SQLite. Now, I found a MCP server that connects to SQLite databases directly so that it can write and read information from the database. So where did I find this MCP server? Well, there is this great repository by Anthropic, which is kind of the official server example directory for Model Context Protocol, and it's under Model Context Protocol servers. All of these links will be in the description down below. And in here, you'll find many MCP servers which are officially vetted by Anthropic. So in the source folder, I can, for example, search for SQLite, and then you will indeed see that there is a folder in here which contains that SQLite MCP server. So what I've done is I've cloned this repository locally, and just to keep it simple, I've actually put it inside of my project in here in a folder that I do not commit to Git. So in this servers folder, you will see that I've got that source folder and I've got the SQLite example MCP server in here as well. Now, this is a MCP server that I need to add to Visual Studio Code, and Visual Studio Code together with Copilot hasn't had MCP support up until now. So this is a pretty new feature, and if you follow along with me, you'll be far ahead of others. So the way that you have to add this MCP server is by, of course, first checking out what the description of the MCP server says in terms of how to enable the MCP server. So if we scroll down here, we see that if we want to use it in Cloud Desktop, we have to run this command. Now, of course, we're not using Cloud Desktop, but effectively you have to run a similar command when you add an MCP server to Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to go and actually open up Visual Studio Code next to this web page so we can keep track of the command. And then in Visual Studio Code, you want to go to View, Command Palette, and then you can go to MCP Server, and you can actually go to MCP List Servers just to see what you've got already. And you can add a new server from here. And I'm going to do a manual install because I'm going to run this MCP server locally. And then here I have to pass the command to run. Now, we're going to kind of adapt the command that you see here. So we're going to start with UV, which is a Python package manager. Links in the description if you don't have it installed. And then I'm going to go and pass in directory. And in this case, of course, my directory is here. So I'm going to go and copy the entire path, and then I'm going to paste it in here. And next, I need to say run MCP server SQLite, and I have to pass the path of my database. So in my case, the database is in here, plant_care.db, because it's just a local database. Very simple. My app does not need anything more complex. And I can copy that entire path as well and paste it at the end of the command. So that's great. I'm going to press enter and give this a nice ID. So I'm probably going to call it SQLite MCP server plants because it's specific to that project. Now, as you can see, the settings.json file for VSCode will have this server included in the MCP configuration. So now if I focus fully on Visual Studio Code and we open up Copilot, we should see here that the tools are available. So they're not here yet, but I can press this refresh button to refetch all of my MCP server tools. And now we actually do see that we've got new tools available. I already played around with some MCP servers, so this is a Notion server that I've been using, but now you can see that we got that SQLite MCP server plan server available to us with a couple of really important methods, like being able to read a bunch of data from the database, being able to write to the database, create tables, list tables, etc. So all I'm going to do now is I'm not going to tell Copilot too much about my application. I'm simply going to ask it to add dummy data to my application as follows. I'm first going to just make sure it's actually in the context of my app. So I'm just going to open a file that's in the root folder. And then I'm going to say, I want you to add dummy data to my database. Add plants, water history, data, and observations that you inject into the database directly using MCP. And you can see here that I'm using the agent mode together with Claude 3.7 Sonnet. And what it's going to do is you can already see it's going to use list tables to get an overview of all of the tables in my local database. And this way, it can actually get the schema of the database and understand what kind of data needs to be injected and which columns are present in the tables, of course. So you can see that completely autonomously, it's using the scribe table to get an overview of how all of these tables work. And I don't even have to prompt it to do that. It already knows that these functions are available because of the MCP integration. And now it's going to use write query to insert a bunch of plants into the database directly. So in my application, I'm just going to go back to the home screen, and you can already see that a bunch of example plants have been added, like a peace lily, snake plant, and yeah, a bunch of other tests like a rubber plant as well. Glossy leaves growing steadily, so that's quite fun. And you can indeed see that by adding all of this dummy data, you can test a lot of things about your application, such as the responsiveness. So for example, if I make my window smaller, you can see that nicely all of the plants now appear in one single column. And of course, you can just test a bunch of the, UX behaviors, like, maybe if this list gets too long, we actually need to build some kind of pagination system. So that's the real advantage of adding this kind of dummy data to your application, because you can actually test your application if it was used by a power user who has a lot of plants, right? So those plants are now working. And you can even see that it's starting to add all of those watering events now, as well as the observation. So I think if I just open up a random plant, we should be seeing some dummy data for that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that snake plant. And you can indeed see that we've got a watering history here, as well as some observations. And just to show you that that actually works properly, I can also just add records myself, like 250 ml, no notes, and I can record the watering. So of course, I've added dummy data, but I can still test the application properly to make sure that it works. So that's great. Now, what I want to really do is make sure that other developers that might be working on this project can actually replicate this dummy data. And this is where a lot of tutorials stop. They just show you this cool integration and they're like, whoa, this is the future of coding. And, I don't disagree, but you have to understand that you actually need to make sure that other developers on your team, or maybe people trying to adopt your project, can also use this dummy data. So the way that I would approach this is by actually asking Copilot in this case to create a SQL file that contains a database migration. So basically, all of the commands that it executed so far, they need to just be added to one single SQL file that you can then execute on a later date to actually get the same dummy data, even if it's on a completely different machine. Because the moment I start a new chat, this history is going to be gone, right? So we want to make sure that other people can also include this dummy data. The way I'm going to do this is by asking it to make sure other devs can also have this dummy data by extracting all the new inserts into a new migration file. Now, this is a great test for Copilot because I do actually have a bit of a migration setup present in my repository already. In here, I've got a database folder, and you can see that actually I've got some migrations for creating those initial tables, as well as inserting some data already. So actually, Copilot should definitely be able to find this. And if we look here in the chat, you can indeed see it's trying to find a bunch of files or folders that have something to do with migration or schema. So it autonomously tries to find that folder. I could have, of course, passed it myself, but I'm just trying to challenge Copilot and see how far it can get. So here you go. It's going to try and generate a new schema file. So let's go and continue with that npx command and see what happens. So it opens up a new terminal, runs that command, and you can see now that it just made up some parameters that don't exist. I'm not here to show you a perfect Copilot implementation. The fact of the matter is these AI agents, they are wrong often, but it should be able to self-correct here. That's the most important question. So now it's just going to actually create a migration file directly in this folder, which is also fine. In this case, the self-correction is that it's just going to create its own SQL file in here, which is totally fine. That's a fine method to do this as well. So let's continue on with that. And now you can see that it's created this new dummy plant data SQL file. Great. Now the question is, of course, is it going to fill it with the correct insert statements? Let's see. Okay, so that did take a little while, but now it came up with a file that indeed contains a lot of insert statements. So it's inserting all of this dummy data into plants. Then it's got the watering events and it's got the observations. So that looks good. I'm just going to click on keep. And now it's actually going to update some of these metadata files as well, which is usually something that these commands that it tried to execute before would do for you, but now it's going to do them manually. So you can see here, it's adding that migration as a new index. So that looks good to me. I'm going to keep that change. And what we're going to do once it's done is we're going to fully delete the database and run all of these migrations to see if it actually works end to end. So now we're in a new chat and I'm going to ask it to do the most challenging thing yet. I'm going to ask it to delete the database, create a new one, and then run the migration so that the dummy data is present again. So I'm going to do it by asking, drop the database, then recreate it and apply migrations. Now, this is totally safe to do because, again, that MCP server is only connected to our dev server explicitly. It's not like it's just going to somehow be able to connect to other databases. That doesn't happen. So now it's going to autonomously check the schema, the index, which is a file that contains information about the database file that we use. So I'm curious to see if it's actually going to delete that file or not. But it seems to just first get a better idea of how everything works in my repository. And now indeed it's going to delete the plant care database file. That is the correct way to do it in terms of SQLite because that's just one single file that you can easily delete, and that's totally fine. So let's go ahead and remove that. And I'm curious to see how it's going to actually follow up on that. So it's removed this database file. Now it's going to go ahead and run the database migration script. Sounds good to me. But looks like we have a problem. So I see this issue here, range error, the supplied SQL string contains more than one statement. Now, I'll tell you a little secret. I actually kind of expected this to happen already. The issue is that the newest script that the AI model created before doesn't contain any breakpoints between the different statements. Now, depending on the migration tool that you're using, this is not necessary, but for this migration tool that we're using today, it is. And you can see this too in the other files that you've got this kind of statement breakpoints between every single SQL statement. And because this new file that the AI created doesn't have that, the migration actually doesn't work. Now, I can see here that it's just going to do some crazy things like creating a new JavaScript file and applying each migration separately. I get why it's trying to do that, but because I already know what the problem is, I'm actually just going to be leading here and ask it more explicitly how I can actually solve this problem. So I'm going to cancel this outright. I'm going to ask it to do the following. Your newest 0002 migration file does not have, and then I'm going to paste the statement breakpoint in here, between each SQL query, unlike the other migration scripts. This is the root cause of this range error. So I'm just going to copy paste that as well. And it really should understand here that it needs to modify that migration script and add those statement breakpoints. So let's see if it picks up on that. So it's going to read the contents of that migration file. And now you can see that it's starting to add those edits. So we have all of these statement breakpoints now. And the nice thing about checking the diff here is that we can even see very clearly that it's not messing with the SQL file once it's done here. Yep, there we go. And it's mainly just adding those statement breakpoints. So that looks good to me. Now, actually, I can already see one more problem here. It adds a statement breakpoint at the very end of the file. And I'm just familiar with this migration library. So I know that this is actually a problem because what's going to happen now is in the migration library is actually going to look for another SQL statement after this breakpoint. And because this line is empty, it's actually just going to throw an error. And this is also why the other migration scripts have the breakpoints, but they don't have it at the very end of the file. So I am actually going to ask it to correct that. Correct this by removing the final breakpoint line. Of course, I could be doing this myself, but I just want to make sure we're still in this flow so that when it corrects this, it's then going to run the migration script itself. I'm not that lazy. Of course, I can remove that line myself. I just want to make sure that we're in the context of the agent mode in total, right? So now you can see it just basically only got rid of that one line. So that looks good to me. We can keep these changes. And now we can most likely run that migration script properly. So it's going to delete the database file again. And then now we should get the request to run the migration. Let's wait for that. There we go. So we're going to run that. And boom, running migrations completed successfully. But let's of course check if that's actually the case. So we still have the application running here in my terminal. So I'm going to go to my browser and then fully refresh the page. Now we can indeed see that all of those different plants are there, and I can check them out and of course see that the watering history is there together with all of the observations. So even though this wasn't a perfect run by Copilot, you can see how it helped me to create a bunch of dummy data. I didn't have to come up with those plans myself. And while you do need to know what you're doing, you can't just accept all of the changes. I only had to make minimal changes that just relied on my previous exposure to these libraries. So as always, when you're coding with AI, it's best to use libraries that you actually know so that you can steer the agent when it's wrong, because AI simply isn't perfect. But I do hope that this illustrates to you how nice AI can be to help you out in the development process, because I can use this tool to create a bunch of actual dummy data that makes sense in the context of my application. 5 years ago, I would have had to enter a bunch of dummy data with random characters that doesn't make sense, but now because of LLMs, I can actually add real data that makes sense in the context of my application, like actual plant names, right? So I hope this video helped you, and if you're curious to connect AI coding to way more applications and even create your own MCP servers, you should check out the community in the link below, where I teach you to become a real AI engineer. I'll see you there.